The sun hung low over Palatine Hill, turning the marble rooftops of Rome into sheets of fire. The air was heavy with incense and whispers. It was 38 Common Era, and the empire was at the height of its glory. Or so they said. But every empire, no matter how golden its crown, carries a sickness in its bones. Through the corridors of power walked a child dressed as a queen. Valeria Messalina, 15 years old, her wrists lost in folds of silk. She'd been chosen to marry the new Emperor Claudius, a man twice her age, worn down by time and frailty, but armored with imperial authority. To the Roman public, it was a sacred union, a symbol of rebirth after years of madness under Caligula. To Messalina, it felt more like a sentence than a ceremony. Welcome back to Underbelly Bloodline, where we unearth the stories the world tried to bury. If you believe history hides its darkest truths behind polite lies, then subscribe and open this file with me. The palace was a maze of eyes and marble. Eunuchs, slaves, senators, everyone watching, judging, calculating. She moved through it silently, the hem of her gown whispering across cold stone, each step echoing like a vow she never chose to make. Outside, Rome roared, a city swollen with ambition, its gutters thick with the blood of those who displeased the gods of power. They called her the promise of virtue, the girl meant to cleanse the imperial name. But virtue, in Rome, was a weapon. It was the mask they made women wear before they broke them. Behind her, painted calm, fear coiled like a serpent, and with it, something sharper, a hunger to survive, no matter what it cost her soul. She would learn quickly that in Rome, love was a tool, loyalty was a lie, and every caress could carry a dagger. The empire expected obedience, but the girl they crowned would not stay silent forever. And in that quiet, trembling heart of marble, where innocence met empire, the first crack began to form, a whisper of rebellion beneath the veil of purity. The story of Messalina is not just about Rome's fall, it's about how power and desire decay from within, how virtue can turn to venom when caged too long. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because from the hollers of Appalachia to the ruins of Rome, corruption wears the same face. If you're drawn to stories where bloodlines, betrayal, and forbidden hunger intertwine, make sure you subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline and step deeper into the shadows where history still bleeds. The years that followed her wedding were steeped in gold and silence. Within the towering walls of the Palatine Palace, Messalina became what Rome demanded, the perfect empress, sculpted from grace and obedience. Her days moved like ritual, the ceremonies, the feasts, the watchful eyes of men who praised her virtue, even as they feared her youth. They called her Augusta, mother of the empire's hope. She bore 2 children, and the people cheered, Britannicus, the heir to Claudius, and Octavia, a daughter of noble blood. Her face was stamped on coins, her smile on statues. To the crowds in the forum, she was an image of peace after years of madness. But images are only reflections, and reflections can lie. Behind the polished marble, something restless stirred. Claudius, her husband, spent his nights among scrolls and scholars, speaking to history more than to her. He was kind, perhaps, but distant, a man too old to understand the pulse that throbbed beneath her quiet skin. So, Messalina learned another art, not love, but survival. She studied the senators, the generals, the priests, how they bowed, how they lied, how power truly moved. In public, she smiled, slow, deliberate, serene. In private, she watched, calculating, unblinking. Every gesture became part of the dance. The turn of her head, the lowering of her eyes, even her silence carried meaning. Rome saw innocence. But in that stillness, a fire was growing, coiled behind her ribs, waiting for its moment to burn. Because in the palace, beauty was not just adored, it was feared. A single whisper from her could end a career. A single glance could make or break a man. And those who once praised her softness began to tremble when she passed, unsure if her favor was blessing or warning. Messalina had mastered the empire's oldest language, the unspoken one. She became the mask Rome wanted her to wear, and then she learned how to weaponize it. The question is, when a mask fits too perfectly, can the person beneath it ever escape? Rome never slept. It breathed. At night, the city pulsed with murmurs, torchlight flickering across alleyways. the scent of wine and dust mingling with secrets too heavy for daylight. And among those whispers, one name began to ripple through the streets like a ghost: Messalina. They said the Empress herself, the wife of the Emperor Claudius, mother of his heirs, had been seen beyond the palace gates, cloaked and nameless. A woman of silks and sapphires walking through the Subura, Rome's underbelly, a labyrinth of brothels, taverns, and forgotten gods. The story was impossible, and yet it was delicious. They whispered that she slipped into a brothel not as a ruler, but as a girl who wanted to feel something real, that she left her crown behind for the anonymity of shadow, trading her imperial robes for the skin of an ordinary woman. They said she laughed among strangers, drank from clay cups, and lost herself in the forbidden hum of the city. No one knew the truth, and that was the danger. Because in Rome, a rumor was sharper than a dagger, and it cut without mercy. Senators pretended not to hear. Courtiers exchanged knowing looks. Servants whispered behind locked doors, and guards swore they saw a cloaked figure vanish through the palace gardens at night. The empire, once built on marble and reason, now trembled under the weight of a woman's hunger, not just for love, but for control over her own life. For Messalina, maybe it was rebellion, maybe it was loneliness. When a cage is gilded, does it still feel like freedom? The city that adored her virtue now began to taste blood in her defiance, and in the corners of the palace, men with cold eyes began to take note. They watched, they whispered back, they plotted. Because in Rome, power was never stolen. It was seduced. The first whispers had begun, and once they started, they would never stop. So tell me, do you believe she truly walked those streets, or was it Rome itself projecting its sins onto her face? Rome loved its performances, but the grandest stage of all wasn't in the amphitheater. It was hidden within the marble chambers of the palace, where power met appetite and the night wore a mask of perfume and deception. They called it the theater of sin, a place where the empire's heartbeat slowed to a dangerous rhythm, one fueled by lust, envy, and the fragile thrill of being seen. Ancient writers, Tacitus, Juvenal, Suetonius, tell of banquets that began as feasts and ended as spectacles, tables draped in purple, torches burning low, the air thick with wine and whispers. Nobles who once commanded armies were made to dance. Gladiators were summoned not to kill, but to entertain the eyes of Rome's hidden sovereign, Messalina. Whether these tales were truth or venom, history remembers the imagery. The young empress seated like a goddess, surrounded by laughter that sounded too much like surrender. Her power no longer came from her title, but from her mastery of shame itself. They said she weaponized desire, that she learned how to humiliate the mighty with a smile, making senators bow not from duty, but from hunger. Each night blurred the line between ruler and captive, and those who stepped into her orbit left changed, some obsessed, some ruined, some never seen again. But look deeper, and you'll find something colder than seduction. Beneath the stories of orgies and revels, there is a woman trapped inside her own creation, a girl who once stood trembling on her wedding day, now ruling the empire from behind a veil of silk and danger. Because when you are surrounded by predators, sometimes the only way to survive is to become one. Rome called her monstrous, unholy, deranged. But the truth? The empire itself was the monster, and she merely held up the mirror. There are stories Rome never meant to survive, tales whispered in smoke-filled taverns and scratched into parchment by poets who despised the women they could never control. One of those tales, half myth, half memory, speaks of a night so decadent that even the gods turned their faces away. They called it the Games of Flesh, a challenge whispered between two women, the Empress Messalina and Scylla, Rome's most famed courtesan. The poets claimed that one night, under flickering lamplight and the drunken roar of noblemen, the two women competed in a contest no law could name, not for pleasure, but for dominance. Juvenal wrote that Messalina, cloaked not in jewels but in defiance, outlasted her rival, taking 30 men before dawn's first light. To him, it was proof of her depravity. To others, it became something else, a symbol of rebellion. Because in the heart of that obscene legend, buried beneath Rome's moral poison, lived a dangerous truth. Messalina had taken what was always used against women, desire, shame, lust, and turned it into her own weapon. In a world that humiliated women to keep them obedient, she rewrote humiliation itself into a language of power. Whether the story was real or born from slander, it became part of her shadow. The senators laughed in public and trembled in private because a rumor like that could only mean one thing, that the empress no longer feared their judgment. And in Rome, a woman without fear was more terrifying than any army. So, what began as satire, as filth meant to destroy her name, became her immortality. Centuries would pass, and still the image would linger. Messalina, the imperial temptress who proved that even desire could be conquered by will. But behind that myth, perhaps there was still a girl who once wanted only to be seen, and who learned that in Rome, power was the only way to exist. By now, Rome was whispering her name like a curse, not as a queen, not as a lover, but as something far more dangerous, a collector of secrets. They said she had villas hidden beyond the city, where the air smelled of oil lamps and deceit, that nobles were invited not for feasts, but for initiation. Senators, generals, priests, men who spoke of virtue by day, entered those doors with trembling hands. And when they left, they carried more than shame. They carried her silence and the price that came with it. There were whispers of scribes keeping records, names, titles, sins, each one a thread she could pull if power began to slip from her grasp. No historian ever proved it. No document ever surfaced. But the story fits too perfectly. A woman turning the empire's fear of scandal into her own private army. Because in Rome, reputation was life. And Messalina understood that a single rumor could destroy a man faster than a blade ever could. While Claudius signed decrees and played the scholar, his young wife was learning to rule in silence, not from the throne, but from the shadows beneath it. Her enemies called it corruption. Her allies called it brilliance. But to the people watching from the streets, the bakers, the beggars, the slaves, she became a ghostly figure, wrapped in silk and sin, pulling invisible strings that made the empire tremble. Every glance, every smile, every whispered promise, all part of the machinery she built from human weakness. And like any great engine, it needed only one thing to keep running: fear. Whether those villas truly existed, or whether history merely dreamed them into being, the myth remains. The empress who ruled not with armies, but with the threat of exposure. The woman who learned that in a world ruled by men, sometimes the only way to survive was to make them afraid of what they'd already done. Rome still gleamed in the sunlight. White marble, red banners, the clatter of sandals echoing down the forum. But if you listened close, beneath the laughter of merchants and the clang of blacksmiths, there was another sound, a quieter one, the slow, steady rod of trust. Messalina's name had become a poison passed from mouth to mouth. Senators no longer spoke her title with reverence, but with dread, afraid that even saying her name aloud might summon ruin. Behind every curtain, every banquet, every gesture of loyalty, there was suspicion. Had she been there too? Had her spies seen? Had her hand guided this decision, this death, this disgrace? Claudius, the emperor, the scholar, the old man with parchment-stained fingers, seemed smaller now. His decrees still carried the weight of Rome, but his voice trembled behind the shadow of his wife. Every scandal that touched her name bled into his own. Each whisper of her infidelity scraped at the empire's dignity. Rome, once proud of its discipline, began to choke on its indulgence. The people felt it, in the markets, in the temples, in the eyes of soldiers who no longer saluted with conviction. Priests burned incense to cleanse the air, but the smoke couldn't hide the stench of decay. Power, Rome was learning, doesn't die in battle. It dies quietly, when faith in it fades. And that faith was fading fast. The Senate, once the marble spine of civilization, was crumbling from within. Men who once ruled provinces now trembled at the thought of being named in her games. Wives refused to attend her feasts. Servants crossed themselves when her carriage passed by. Even the gods, some whispered, had turned their faces away. The empire marched on. Legions still conquered, ships still sailed, but its heart was poisoned, not by sword or plague, but by one woman's legend swelling beyond her control. And somewhere within the Palatine walls, Messalina must have felt it too. The tremor in the air, the faint shift in tone when her name was spoken. She had ruled through desire and fear, but those are fragile empires. Once they begin to crack, there's no rebuilding them. Because Rome could survive invasion, it could survive famine, but it could not survive the death of its own virtue. Rome had seen madness before, emperors who crowned their horses, generals who declared themselves gods, but nothing like this. It was the autumn of 48 CE, and the empire still basked under its illusion of control. Claudius, the scholar emperor, had gone to Ostia to inspect the harbor, his mind fixed on trade and grain. Behind him, in the golden echo of the Palatine Palace, his young empress plotted something unthinkable. Messalina, wife of the emperor, mother of his heirs, guardian of Rome's dignity, married another man, not in whispers, not under moonlight, but in full daylight, before the eyes of priests and witnesses. Her groom was Gaius Silius, a senator of noble birth and reckless beauty, the kind of man whose ambition burned hotter than sense. Together they stood before the gods, their hands clasped, the air thick with incense and disbelief. The ritual followed every Roman law. The marriage contract was sealed, the sacrifices made, the vows spoken. By law, this was no tryst, it was treason. To marry while the emperor still lived was to crown a rival, to split Rome's heart in two. No one could believe it. Had she gone mad? Or was it something colder, a declaration that Claudius no longer mattered, that she, the empress, now held the empire in her own right? The witnesses stood silent, torn between awe and horror. Some later said it was love, that she had grown tired of an aging husband and wanted a man of fire and youth. Others swore it was ambition, that Silius and Messalina dreamed of ruling together, of replacing Claudius entirely. But maybe it was neither. Maybe it was compulsion, that dark spiraling hunger to test how far her power could reach before the world finally broke. When news of the wedding crept through the marble halls, senators froze mid-step. The empire itself seemed to shudder, for in Rome, the bedchamber was as political as the battlefield, and Messalina had just waged war against her own emperor with a bridal veil and a kiss. While Claudius studied maps in distant Ostia, the city burned with whispers. The empress has taken another husband. The emperor has been replaced. The gods themselves must be laughing. And somewhere between those murmurs and the shrines of the gods, the gears of fate began to turn, slow, heavy, and inevitable. Because in Rome, there was no sin greater than humiliation, and Claudius, the patient scholar, was about to learn that even the meekest man can summon wrath when his crown and his pride are stolen. The news reached Claudius like a whisper carried by ghosts. At first he laughed, an old man's disbelief. His empress, his wife, married to another man in the heart of his own empire? Impossible, absurd, the joke of jealous tongues. But when the proof arrived, the witnesses, the signatures, the sacred vows spoken in his absence, that laughter broke. And in its place came something colder. Claudius rose, trembling with a rage that had been decades in the making. For years he had endured the whispers, the humiliation, the mockery of Rome's senators and soldiers. But this was open treason. He ordered his chariots turned toward Rome. The emperor who had been mocked as meek was now the hunter, and the walls of the Palatine trembled before him. Messalina fled through the gardens that had once been her kingdom. The lilies and marble fountains stood silent witnesses to her undoing. Once she had ruled these paths like a goddess, courted, worshipped, feared. Now, barefoot and frantic, she stumbled through her own paradise-turned prison. She begged for an audience, for mercy, for time to explain, but mercy had already fled the city. The guards surrounded her by the laurel groves, their armor glinting in the dying light. A soldier, silent, unmoved, read the order aloud. By decree of Emperor Claudius, Valeria Messalina is to die. Her voice broke. She pleaded for her children, for her name, for the chance to live as anything but the monster Rome had made her. When no one answered, she took the dagger in trembling hands. But courage, the kind she had once wielded with such cruelty, deserted her. The blade slipped. Her resolve failed. And so, another hand finished the task. Steel met flesh. The empress fell. The gardens that had once smelled of roses and honey filled instead with iron and dust. By dawn, her statues were torn from their pedestals. her name chiseled from inscriptions. Claudius ordered her memory erased, damnatio memoriae, the final Roman punishment, not of body, but of legacy. It was said that even the birds fell silent that day, as if Rome itself paused to mourn what it had created and then destroyed. The woman once called goddess of desire now belonged to the earth, nameless, forgotten, buried beneath the empire she had poisoned and personified. Yet legends like hers never truly die. They rot beneath the marble, waiting for centuries to remember. They buried her name, but they could not bury her shadow. In the days that followed her death, Rome tried to cleanse itself, to wash away the scent of her perfume, the echo of her laughter, the stain of her rebellion. Statues were smashed, portraits defaced, scrolls burned. The empire called it damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory. But memory does not die when carved from stone. It lingers, in whispers, in fear, in fascination. Centuries passed, and still her story bled through the cracks of time. To the poets, she became a symbol of corruption, the woman who ruined an empire with lust and deceit. To the moralists, she was proof that women could never be trusted with power. And yet, to those who looked closer, Messalina was not merely a sinner, she was a reflection. A mirror held up to Rome itself, a civilization that preached virtue while drowning in vice, that crowned purity in public and worshipped indulgence in private. The truth, perhaps, is crueler than legend. Messalina was born into a world that prized obedience and punished desire. A child promised to an aging emperor, her youth turned into currency for political peace. So, when she took back her body, her voice, her power, even through ruin, Rome called it madness. But maybe it was survival. Maybe the empire feared her not for her sins, but because she dared to expose theirs. Now the Palatine stands in ruin. The marble has faded, the gardens are dust. But walk there at twilight, and some swear they still feel her presence. A flicker of silk, a whisper carried through the cypress trees. The ghost of an empress who refused to be erased. Her story endures because it warns us still. Empires do not crumble by invasion. They decay from within, not from swords, but from secrets, not from blood, but from shame. Messalina's curse is not her death, it's her immortality. For as long as power demands purity, her shadow will rise again, reminding us that when virtue becomes a weapon, sin becomes the only way to survive. So, tell me, do you think she was Rome's ruin, or simply its reflection? Let me know where you're watching from. And if you believe history's ghosts still whisper through time, subscribe to Underbelly Bloodline, where every fallen empire leaves behind a soul that refuses to rest.